All right, hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. I'm Ben Spagan and I'm the Vice President at the Jefferson and I'm a contributing editor at the Erie Reader.
Hi, and I'm Angela Beaumont. I'm the Director of Operations at the Jefferson.
And joining us in conversation here today is Mr. Mark Squeglia.
Mark is no stranger to the Jefferson stage. Many of you might recall his recently Jefferson digital program on working remotely, but might also recall his various programs rooted in history, particularly focusing on World War II, which he's been offering at the Jefferson since 2010. Mark graduated from Gannon University in 1979 with his degree in history. He went on to work for Hammermill Paper Company, Erie Insurance, Prescott Insurance, and General Electric. He currently works for Linium, a software consulting firm. Mark was a member of the Perry 200 Commission. While Mark's interest is in all periods of history, his focus and specialty are on military history, specifically World War II history. Mark also serves as the secretary of the board of directors at the Hagen History Center.
For this program, we are here to discuss a World War II topic, the Invasion of Normandy. Of course, a date important that we acknowledge this month in June. We'll have a discussion of the immense battle plans, the invasion strategy, and major players from June 6th to September 1944, as well as talk about the mistakes made by both the German army and the Allied forces, and why it was imperative that the invasion succeed.
This program was originally scheduled as part of the Jefferson Satellite Programming Initiative and was to take place at the Corey Higher Educational Council. Because of social distancing due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we are still offering our programming digitally, but do thank our partners at the Corey Higher Ed for helping us get the word out and working with us on this program.
And since this program is first airing live on the Jefferson's Facebook page, we are going to work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you do have a question, just leave it below in the comments section. We're going to do our best to get through as many as we can. If you happen to be watching a later broadcast of this event, please still feel free to share your questions with us, and we'll do our best to get them along to Mark. And of course, for more information about upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs and publications, please visit www.jeserie.org and like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Mark, welcome back to the Digital Jefferson.
Thanks, Ben and Angela. I'm really honored to be able to talk to you today about this day, which is so important in our country's history. But as this day is important, we cannot forget about all the other of our countrymen who served during World War II and fought in many other battles. Their sacrifice was no less important or critical to ending the war. June 6, 1944 receives a lot of focus, a lot of publicity due to its scope, and it was the start of the final chapter, ending Hitler's regime and his occupation of Europe. 76 years ago this month, in the early morning hours of June 6, 1944, the Allied invasion of Europe began. Back in 2010, I had the great fortune to be able to visit Normandy and spend a week roaming the beaches and the other sites in Normandy. So in the slide deck that I'm going to share, you will see photos of the beaches, remnants of the West Wall, and of the Norman countryside. And Ben, if we run out of time, maybe we can schedule a follow-up to continue where we left off.
Appreciate your flexibility, Mark. We're going to do our best to try to get through everything, but I do appreciate that. If we need to, we'll certainly come back because, like you said, critically important topic. Here we are, decades later, still revisiting it and taking a look at why it's so important that we do not forget this portion of history.
Okay to share?
Good to go ahead and share. And first question goes over to Angela.
Mark, typically we'd say, let's start at the beginning, but let's start before the beginning. Let's take a look at pre-invasion strategy. What were the military and political situations, so to speak?
We're going to look at what the situations were in 1942, 1943, why the Allies had a Germany first strategy, and what were the political situations. But before we even get there, we need to focus on the orders that were given to General Eisenhower in early December 1943, because this sentence forced and guided his strategy throughout the entire European campaign. Specifically, the language there that he will enter the continent of Europe in conjunction with other allies and undertake operations aimed at the heart of Germany and, most importantly, the destruction of her armed forces. As we will see later in the war, it is this language that guided Eisenhower not to race to Berlin and capture Berlin before the Russians, which caused quite a bit of controversy. But if we look at the military situation in 42, specifically, let's start in the Pacific. Shortly after Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, into the spring of 42, the Japanese hit their high water mark. Wake Island falls and the Marine garrison is captured. Bataan in the Philippines falls. MacArthur transfers down to Australia. As a result of the fall of Bataan, the entire Philippines Islands fall to the Japanese, and the Pearl of the Orient, Singapore, is captured by the Japanese as the British lose Singapore, which was considered to be impregnable. If we switch over to Europe in early 42, we got to go back and remember that from June of 40 to June of 41, the British basically faced Germany and Hitler totally on their own. They were kicked out of Norway, and not in any particular order, but they were kicked out of Norway, France, Greece, and Crete. And the Germans were threatening to the Suez Canal at this point in time. But in June of 41, Hitler makes probably one of his largest, if not the largest mistake, and he decides to invade Russia in June of 41. If we go to close to the end of 41, Russia is on the brink of collapse. Germany is at the gates of Moscow, which is considered the political industrial capital of Russia. And the Allies are of the opinion that if Moscow falls, Russia will fall. Or worse, Russia will sue for a separate peace with Germany without the Allies intervening. So there's nothing positive from June of 40 through December 7th, 1941, until early spring in 42, and it happens in the Pacific. We see the Doolittle Raid, where the U.S. put medium Army bombers on one aircraft carrier, and we bombed various cities in the Japanese island, Tokyo as well. Militarily, not consequential at all, but morale and impact on the Japanese was tremendous. This totally shook up their high command, and it forced their strategy in the Pacific to maybe be altered a bit than what they had planned. Shortly after the Doolittle Raid, we see the battles of Coral Sea as the Japanese try to acquire and occupy Port Moresby in New Guinea. And their goal there was to eliminate or push Australia out of the war, eliminate the threaten or interdict the lifeline, the shipping lanes between the U.S. and Australia, basically taking Australia out of the war. And then we have the Battle of Midway in June of 42, where the U.S. decisively defeated the Japanese Navy, eliminating 4 of their top-line fleet aircraft carriers. And then moving to August of 42, the U.S. invade Guadalcanal, and we start the Solomon campaign. But politically, the Allies, specifically Churchill and FDR, fear that Stalin's going to cut a separate peace deal with Germany. If you look at these numbers, you can see from 41 to 43, the predominance of German military machine was in the Eastern Front. So for 2 years of the war, Russia was basically carrying the majority of the water and the heavy lifting during World War II. Stalin fears, conversely to the fear that FDR and Churchill had, that he was going to cut a separate deal, a peace deal with Germany. He feared that there would never be a second front in Europe. And he thought that the Western Allies were following a strategy of merely letting the Russians perform all of the heavy fighting. The Western Allies can't afford to have Russia capitulate. If Germany had the ability to move all of the manpower from the Eastern Front to France, they'd have over 170 army divisions in France. And it's theoretically would be almost impossible for the US and the British to invade and land on the coast of France with that specter of that kind of manpower. So it's at this time, at the Acadia Conference in Canada, that FDR and Churchill meet and they decide this needs to be a Germany first strategy. Germany is looked to be the most impactful threat of the Axis powers, more impactful, more detrimental than Japan. So we need to eliminate the threat to the UK and to Russia. We cannot lose the UK as a base of operations, and we must keep Russia in the war. What were our strategic views in 42? Well, the US wanted to cross the channel immediately and knock Germany out of the war as quickly as they could. We had fears that Russia would not be able to last very long. And again, as I said earlier, if Russia's knocked out of the war, all the troops from the Eastern Front would move westward. But it's not conceivable that we can invade Europe, Northern Europe, in 42. Our troops aren't mobilized. Our industry is still in the process of building up. The British oppose a cross-channel attack in 42 because they've been kicked off the continent so many times that the next time they go back, they want to stay. So the strategy in 42 becomes FDR and Churchill decide that we're going to invade North Africa because they feel it's winnable. The Suez is threatened. It won't take a high number of forces. The British are already fighting in North Africa, and we can quickly get the US engaged there. If we look at 43 from a military, political, and strategic point of view, what has happened in the Pacific, the US has moved up the Solomon chain. We've secured Port Moresby in New Guinea. We've started the Central Pacific Drive by landing at Tarawa, and we've reclaimed the Aleutian Islands that were invaded early in 42 by the Japanese. In Europe, the British and the Americans, the British have pushed Rommel back across the desert from the border of Egypt all the way to Tunisia. And he's caught in between the US forces, which landed in Western North Africa, between two forces. And we see that Rommel's Africa Corps and the Italian allies totally surrender in the spring of 43. We also see that the post-Stalingrad, where over 600,000 German troops surrendered in early 43, the Russians have pushed back the Germans significantly from the gates of Moscow and from Stalingrad. But there are tremendous casualties in on the Russian front. The Russians average 5 million troops on the front, while the Germans average 3 million troops on the front. Those numbers are staggering compared to what we see in North Africa and what we see in the Sicilian invasion, and then the subsequent invasion of Italy later in 43, September. So from a strategic point of view, Churchill wants to knock Italy out of the war. The goals of invading Sicily and then invading Italy were to occupy German troops and knock one of his allies out of the war. But Again, Churchill and the British did not want to perform the cross-channel invasion in 43.
So, Mark, I want to talk about some of those early plans, and you just brought it up on the screen. We've got acronyms like COSAC, COSSAC, and we've got interesting words, including sledgehammer. So, talk us through that as the buildup continues to taking a look at the Western Front.
So, COSAC is an acronym that stands for Chief of Staff Supreme Allied Command. And it was the planning organization that began planning the cross-channel invasion as early as 42. So it was a plan that was very lengthy in time, was worked on significantly by large groups of British and US military, and it evolved over time. So it took quite a bit of time. COSAC eventually came under Eisenhower's direct control as the supreme headquarters for the Allied Expeditionary Force. Bolero was the plan put together to build up the troops in the UK. And at one point in time, or for a period of time, there were so many US troops in the UK that they began to detrimentally affect the population in the United Kingdom. The saying went that the U.S. troops in the U.K. were oversexed, overpaid, and over here. So there was a significant number of troops that built up in the U.K. in preparation for Overlord in 44. Roundup was the cross-channel attack plan that was developed in 1943 in the event that the British would agree to a cross-channel invasion in 43. And Sledgehammer was the 1942 plan, which was a cross-channel attack in the event that the Russians collapsed and were taken out of the war.
So, Mark, we might more commonly know it as the Battle of Normandy, but its code name was Operation Overlord. Update us on the Allied situation, the German situation, and more as we move towards that date, June 6 in 1944.
So we'll look at a couple of, or all of these bullet points. We're going to look at the Allied command structure. We're going to look at the number of troops. We're going to look at what Operation Fortitude was. We'll take a quick look at the invasion beaches. What were the naval plans? What were the Air Force plans? The airborne drops, and what were the long and short-term objectives? If we look at the Allied command, we see here a picture of Dwight Eisenhower, who was known as SHAF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. And he had a joint command, or a British-US combined command, where there was definitely a mix of both nationalities. Going around the table, we see Omar Bradley, who was of the US Army, and he was the US First Army commander during Overlord, or the Invasion of Normandy. We see Bertram Ramsey, who was the naval commander. Marshal Tedder, who was Eisenhower's deputy commander. We see Bernard Montgomery, who was the ground commander, overall ground commander for the invasion of Normandy. We see Lee Mallory, who was the air commander. And we see Beadle Smith, who was Eisenhower's chief of staff. This group made up the Allied command structure. All decisions came through this group, and all orders were emanated from this group. This is a hard chart to look at and see, but this is a pictorial, a flow chart of the Allied command structure and the German chain of command. We'll get to the German chain of command, but you can immediately look at both and say, man, the Allied chain of command was very clean, very understandable. We had the president and the prime minister of Great Britain sitting at the top. the Combined Chiefs of Staff, which is the group between the U.S. and Great Britain. And then we come down to the Supreme Commander, who was Eisenhower, and then the names of the people on the prior slide. We'll get to this cluster here in a few minutes. If we look at the airborne plans, the invasion beaches, the naval plans, we see that there are 5 invasion beaches going from the east to the west: Sword, Juno, and Gold, which were the British and the Canadian beaches. Those divisions, the 3rd British Division landing at Sword Beach, the 3rd Canadian Division landing at Juno, and the 50th British Division landing at Gold. Their ports of embarkation were in eastern, southeastern England, all meeting at a center or a point in the English Channel called Piccadilly Circus, and then the naval landings would come from there. If we look at the U.S. beaches, we see Omaha and Utah, which is the westernmost beach. On Omaha, we have elements of the 1st U.S. Infantry Division and the 29th Infantry Division. And on Utah Beach, we have the 4th U.S. Infantry Division. On both flanks of the beaches, and this territory covers about 50 kilometers from the western part of Utah to the eastern part of Sword. This is roughly 50 kilometers, which is probably, maybe 40 some miles. My conversions may not be accurate, but it took quite a bit to drive from here all the way to here. If we see the airborne plans, the airborne drops on the Cotentin Peninsula by the 82nd Airborne and the 101st of the U.S. Airborne Divisions were designed to prevent reinforcements from coming onto the beaches. Same thing with the 6th British Airborne Division landing on the eastern flank of the beaches to prevent German reinforcements coming onto the beaches from that area. The naval plans: over 195,000 sailors and 7,000 ships were going to carry all of these men and material and supplies onto the beaches on June 6th. It translates to the largest amphibious operation of all time, maybe rivaled later in the war by the invasion of Okinawa, and then potentially by Operation Desert Storm in terms of scope and size. From an air support standpoint, the U.S. Army Air Corps and the Royal Air Force bombers were to hit the beaches both nightly, the night before, which would end up being the night of June 5th, and on the morning of June 6th, just before the 6 a.m. scheduled invasion. And these bombers were designed to take out elements of the Western Wall, which were all along this coastline, but also to crater the beaches to give the landing troops shelter, because once you'll see some of these photos that we took of the beaches, there is nothing on these beaches. There's no obstacles, there's no trees, there's nothing for the troops to prevent being seen or being shot at. If we look at objectives, and the Overlord plan just wasn't for June 6th, 1944, it was through to the invasion of Germany. So this kind of summarizes what happened post June 6th. Was a slow start and then a fast break. So if you look at this line here, that's where the Allies were to be on June 26th, 3 days from now. But actually they didn't get there till a month later, June 24th. And then there was a breakout, and led by General Patton, who's the topic of another lecture. But this line, which is where it was planned to be on September 3rd, short of Paris, just over the Seine, but it was actually reached on August 23rd. And then the race across France, and you see the line here, which was expected to be reached on May 21st, 1945. We were actually almost on the border of Germany by September of 44. But that's where everything stalled. We ran out of supplies to supply the armies on this line from England directly over the beaches, and then driving supplies all the way across France was insurmountable odds for keeping those troops supplied. Let's look at the German situation. We'll look at their command structure. What were the troop dispositions prior to June 6th? What did they expect from the Pas de Calais? And the leading German generals, Rommel and Von Rundstedt, and then the West Wall. Was it a fact or was it a folly? So if we look at the German troop concentrations, these are their divisions in red. And you can see here, these are the landing beaches. You have 1, 2, maybe 3 divisions along the beaches. And these are considered low strength, low quality infantry divisions. Many of them are staffed by ex-Russian prisoners of war. So they're not the high quality German troops, and they're not the German panzer divisions, the tank divisions. But if you look at the Pas de Calais, which is the shortest spot of the English Channel between Dover, England and Calais, France, you can see how much red is in this area. And this is where the German 15th Army was, I believe, and it was predominantly sitting here waiting for the invasion to come here. And it was because of an operation that the Allies ran, an operation called Operation Fortitude, that we leaked to the Germans through radio traffic, through deception plans, through fake armies, through naming George Patton as the fictitious commander of the 1st U.S. Army Group and stationed him here near Dover, that the Germans thought for sure that we were going to attack through the Pas de Calais. And it wasn't until late June that the Germans and Hitler realized that that was all a feint, and they began moving troops from this area of France and Belgium down to France. So Operation Fortitude worked tremendously. There were counts of fake tanks, fake airplanes being set up by members of Hollywood staff to deceive German air reconnaissance. So it was a total plan to keep the Germans and totally pin these troops down in this area. Let's come back to this chart, looking at the U.S. or the Allied chain of command and the German command structure. Not only is the print small, but I can't understand how the German chain of command works. You had Hitler up at the top, but he also segregated, and decision-making was parceled out to different types of organizations, military organizations. No one had a clear picture of what they should be doing or who should be reporting to whom. So as subsequent reaction and orders to approach Normandy on the morning of June 6th were fragmented, and the German reaction was partial at best. Here we see a picture of Von Rundstedt, who commanded the entire Western Front for Germany, and Rommel, who commanded Army Group B, where the Normandy beaches were in his area of responsibility. Hitler fashioned himself as a military strategist, and as the war went on, made more and more and more military decisions. But what he did was, instead of providing the armor, the panzer divisions under von Rundstedt command or under Rommel's command, Hitler kept the panzer divisions under his command. So we had to, or von Rundstedt and or Rommel had to go to Hitler to get him to release the panzer divisions to come to the invasion beaches. Also, Rommel and von Rundstedt had a differing strategy. Rommel had seen the power of Allied air in North Africa. He understood who commanded the air, basically commanded the battlefield. And what he wanted to do was keep the panzer divisions at the water's edge, because he said, once the Allies land, if they get a foothold, we won't be able to prevent them or throw them back. Whereas von Rundstedt wanted the panzer divisions and the German reinforcements to be congregated back from the coast so that they could react once the Allies landed and defeat them in a major battle. So we have three different strategies, and none of them worked. And finally, let's look at the West Wall. So in June of 1940, Germany invades the Low Countries, Belgium, Holland, Belgium and Holland. And they totally outflanked the Maginot Line, which was on the eastern border of France, designed to prevent a German invasion. If you are a student of history, you know that Germany invaded France in 1870 in the Franco-Prussian War. They invaded France again in 1914. And between 1918 and 1940, the French decided that the best way to prevent another German invasion was to build a wall called the Maginot Line. Well, in 40, the Germans merely go around it. So it's kind of ironic that Hitler spent significant resources, slave labor, massive amounts of concrete, and work to build this Western Wall, which ran from Norway all the way down to the Spanish border, in the hopes of preventing a European invasion. This is a picture of one of the gun emplacements that's still there. And if you look at, you get close to, if you're there and you get close to these concrete structures, these are massively poured with feet upon foot of concrete. And this battery is called the St. Marcouf battery, which is in the vicinity of Utah Beach. And this is a look from the battery itself looking out to the channel. This is another remnant of the Western Wall. This is on Omaha Beach. Strangely or interestingly enough, this does not face the water. This is set up to enfilade down the beach so that the scope of fire from this pillbox or gun emplacement can range all the way down the beach rather than maybe a smaller field of fire if it was facing the water. And another picture from Omaha Beach. The beaches are littered with these emplacements that are still there.
So Mark, one of the things that we've seen on so many of the slides as you go through is that June 6th date. And one of the things you mentioned earlier that you alluded to is June 5th. It looks like the invasion was almost on June 5th. Let's go there. What happened? Why June 6th and not the 5th?
So there were only so many days of weather that were conducive to the landing. There were only so many days of low tide aligned with full moon to provide basically light for the paratroopers. And those were a few days in early June. So the original invasion date was scheduled for June 5th. Unfortunately, the weather in the channel starting on June 4th and into June 5th was so bad that the invasion actually had to be called back. So basically the invasion, the ships started emanating out of the southern English ports to head for off the coast of Normandy in the evening of June 4th. And the weather and the seas and the waves in the channel were so high, the rain was so bad that Eisenhower canceled and called everybody back. So if you read anything or if you've watched The Longest Day, there's a famous scene where they're meeting on the night of June 5th, and the meteorologists are telling them that up to that point that there was no break in the weather. And if they had postponed on June 6th, the next time where the weather was conducive, the tides, the moon, and all the factors, was late June. And the decision was made that there's no way that they can keep 3 million, 4 million men penned up in southern England without the Germans finally figuring out that the invasion is coming. So probably just before midnight on the 5th, or maybe earlier, maybe around 9, 10 o'clock, meteorologists come to Eisenhower and say there's a small break in the weather, probably a 24-hour period of time where the winds die down, the seas calm more than what they were. They weren't totally calm, but that they could go on June 6th. And that's how and why the invasion went from the 5th to the 6th. It was all weather related. If we look at, so as I said, it was to start on the 4th, they turned back, and then top level meeting on the 5th, Eisenhower makes the decision to go. So shortly before midnight, the airborne landings begin. And the British 6th Airborne Division lands here on the eastern part of the beaches to prevent reinforcements coming from potentially the Pas de Calais, which is up in this area here, if we remember the map. And then on the western side, on the Cotentin Peninsula, the 82nd and the 101st Airborne are dropped in areas to secure the area behind Utah Beach, so that when the 4th Infantry Division lands, that they have easy access to getting onto the beaches. This is a picture, actually it's a famous picture of the Pegasus Bridge. This isn't the original, but this is a replacement bridge of the Pegasus Bridge, which the British 6th Airborne Division actually captured shortly after midnight on June 6th. And you can't see it, but over where the picture is being taken from is where the gliders landed, that the British paratroopers then were able to attack and capture the bridge. It was a key bridge because it would be able to funnel reinforcements from the eastern flank of the invasion beaches.
Mark, just a reminder for our audience, those are some of the photos you took when you were over there, that you had the chance to visit. So I just wanted to point that out again from your experience.
Yes. So the airborne troops are landing, and they're causing and wreaking havoc with the Germans because the Germans don't understand what's going on. Some German commanders are thinking these are bomber crews that have parachuted. Some are thinking that the paratroopers are landing to capture their general headquarters. None of them realize that this is a total invasion at this point in time. The paratroopers begin to interdict and capture different crossroads. If you recall the movie The Longest Day, this is a replica of a 101st Airborne trooper who actually landed on the steeple of the church in St. Mary-Glees, which was under attack and prominently featured in the movie. This is another picture of the church, same church in St. Mary-Glees, which is in the center of town, which was the first village captured or liberated by the Allied troops on June 6th. And then this is a picture of the square looking from the church towards the rest of the town. This is a picture inside the church of the stained glass window, and you can see the paratroopers replicas on the stained glass window. And then this is a memorial recently erected, probably within the last 25 years, to the 101st Airborne. Actually, this is to Easy Company, which was made famous by Richard Ambrose's book Band of Brothers, and then Steven Spielberg's series Band of Brothers. Dick Winters and his squad captured German artillery, which was being able to fire onto to Utah Beach in the 4th Infantry Division. So this is on the edge of what's called Brecourt Manor. And then this is just a picture of a hedgerow, which are famous in the Norman countryside. The hedgerows are mounds of earth, that have grown different vines and bushes and shrubs and trees. The intended use of these hedgerows was to define farmers' lands and also keep in their livestock. So these were interlaced all through Normandy, and they became very usable defensive positions for German troops as we go through the Battle of Normandy. If we move from the paratroop drops to the air bombardment, the air plan, the British Air Force was planning a night bombardment constituting roughly about 1,000 British heavy bombers. And then during the daylight hours, just before the invasion was to occur, just before the troops were to hit the beach, the U.S. Army Air Corps was to hit the beaches with their heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24s. The intent was to destroy the German gun emplacements, the west wall that I showed you pictures of. The problem was it totally failed. For whatever reason, the Air Force, or the Air Corps, and the British Royal Air Force decided to fly perpendicular to the coast rather than parallel to the coast. So as they flew perpendicular to the coast, their drops totally missed the gun emplacements on the coastline, and they fell inland, probably killing more cows, Norman cows, than they did German troops. What that did also was, number one, it didn't take out any of the gun emplacements, but as you'll see in a picture soon, it also did not provide any craters or foxholes for the troops as they were landing. So for all intents and purposes, the Allied air bombardment was not very successful. Now, this is a picture of Pointe Du Hoc, which is about a 250-foot escarpment that's situated between let me get my directions correct. This is situated between the western edge of Omaha Beach and the eastern edge of Utah Beach. And Allied intelligence had it that the Germans had placed a tremendous amount of heavy artillery. And you can see the proximity to the ocean, or to the channel, that these guns could interdict and hit Utah Beach very easily, or Omaha Beach very easily. So the decision was made to land the second Ranger Battalion, who would scale these cliffs to take out these gun emplacements if the air bombardment had failed. And here's a picture looking down the cliff. So our troops had to basically climb, rappel up these cliffs, and then take on the Germans who were emplaced on Pointe Du Hoc. And you can see, actually the guns were never there. They were sitting about 10 miles behind the coast. They had not put in place yet. But this area received such heavy air bombardment that the craters are still there today. So let's move to Omaha Beach. We kind of skipped over the British beaches. That's something that we can come back to given the time that we have. But if we look at Omaha Beach, Omaha Beach was the linchpin because Omaha Beach connected the beaches together. Omaha Beach was in the center. It connected the Sword, Gold, and Juneau, and it connected Utah. So if we didn't land successfully on Omaha Beach, we basically had two separate forces that would not be connected, that could be attacked piecemeal, chopped up, and shoved back into the ocean. So Omaha Beach was the linchpin. Unfortunately, Allied intelligence indicated that Utah Beach was lightly defended. And just before D-Day, unbeknownst to Allied intelligence, the Germans moved in additional troops to take the emplacements or sit in the Western Wall emplacements here on Omaha Beach. And Omaha Beach is a very sandy beach, wide expanse of a beach. The great ability to drive tanks and trucks up onto the beach. And Allied teams, reconnaissance teams, would stealthily come into Normandy prior to the invasion and took sand samples back to test the beaches to see if they would support tanks. So we knew that we could land heavy equipment here. But the problem was there was a cliff all along the perimeter of the beach, probably 25 to 40 feet high, which gave the German forces a promontory look, being able to look down on the beaches, which they used very effectively during D-Day. Also, there were only 4 accesses or exits off the beach. Here was a D1 draw at Vierville, 2 by Les Moulins and Saint Laurent, and then 1 at Coville. This is basically the perimeter of Omaha Beach, from Coville to Vierville. Some of these roads were paved, others were paths, and some were dirt roads. So Omaha was the most heavily defended and protected of all the 5 beaches. Also, that the Germans knew that. You know, they knew that this is where we potentially could land. So Rommel strengthened this beach immensely. There were quite a few underwater obstacles, mines that were floating in the ocean and buried on the beaches, heavily defended with quite a few troops.
When Rommel, you said his strategy was to keep Allied forces off the beach. You know, once they got a foothold,
Yep.
he didn't think they could hold them. So it makes
Right.
sense that he's trying to fortify this if they think that if we're coming in Omaha.
Right, and his whole strategy was to defeat us at the water's edge, because and rightfully so. You know, troops that are landing. Number one, the channel was so rough that day, and most of these troops had been on some of these landing ships or landing craft for 48 hours. These are not, you know, cruise liners. These are flat bottom, shallow draft vessels that bounce around like a cork. So most of these guys were so seasick that, you know, then you're going to ask them to fight. And not only that, you're going to dump them halfway to the beach because of the rough seas and because of the fire that's coming off the beaches. You know, many of these poor men never made it to the beach. So Rommel was absolutely right. His strategy was correct. So here's a picture of the west wall at the eastern end at Coville. This is a picture from the bluff looking down on Omaha Beach. So you can see, this is at low tide, so you can see the expanse of beach. And I had read many, many times the we landed at low tide. So basically, the landing craft are hitting the beach here, and you have Germans in the emplacements here shooting machine guns down and mortars and artillery down here. And our troops had to race all the way across the beach to anywhere along here to get some semblance of cover. So one of the things I wanted to do was I wanted to count the number of paces from the water's edge to the seawall where someone could find shelter. And I stopped after 350 paces. So here you have troops running across this beach, seasick, carrying 100 and 120 pounds of equipment in some cases, totally soaking wet, and being fired upon all at the same time. So the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan, which probably was down here at the Veerville section, because it was the Ranger battalion that Tom Hanks was supposedly in, is probably the most realistic recreation of the morning on Omaha Beach. Just totally unbelievable. This is a picture of the Peace Memorial at low tide at Saint Laurent, which is in the middle of Omaha Beach.
And there we saw 3 different flags. We saw the American flag, the Canadian flag, and I presume it's the French flag, Mark, there on the far right.
Yeah, it looks like the French, and we didn't intentionally take the picture to cut the flags up, but I would assume the British flag would be somewhere along there as well.
So take us to end of day situation. The troops are there. They've landed. What do things look like as June 6th is starting to wind down?
Okay. Let me get to the right spot. So end of day, approximately 150,000 troops are landed on the 5 invasion beaches. That includes the airborne landings and the seaborne landings. The Allied casualties are approximately 6,000 killed and wounded. And that includes, or that's 6,000, the majority of them were on Omaha Beach, over 3,000. So at the end of the day, we had successfully pushed inland from Utah Beach, successful landings at Gold, Sword, and Juneau, and made progress inland. It was at Omaha where we were basically maybe just over the summit, and still holding a very thin line on Omaha Beach. The beaches had not linked up, so it was, the 3 British Canadian beaches had linked, but they had not linked up with Omaha, and Utah and Omaha had not linked up, so they were separate. By June 11th, we had landed 326,000 troops, 54,000 vehicles, and 104,000 tons of supplies, all over the beaches. So, I mean, that was a significant logistical hurdle that we were supplying all of our troops basically over the beaches. This is, if you go to the cemetery at Coville, you walk through, first of all, you walk through pretty heavy security. And this is U.S. property. The country of France had given the U.S. this property. So this is U.S. soil. The cemetery and the museum and the visitor center. So you walk through the visitor center, and you're walking down the promenade, and you turn to the left, and this is the view that you see, which was somewhat emotional, as well as inspiring, because you look at the sacrifice that was made by not only the U.S. troops, but the Canadian and the British as well. It's just a sight that you have to be there to see it.
So, Mark, one of the things you talked about were the casualties. Do you know if they're in the planning? And that's going to be one of the hardest parts that go into military strategy and planning is planning for casualties. Did the Army anticipate the amount of casualties? Was it less? Was it more? Did you have anything in your research that revealed that?
The expectation was that they were predicting over 50-60% casualty in the airborne troops. I don't recall expected casualties on the seaborne landings. And, if you look at it, Utah Beach, the casualties were very minimal. Again, the majority were on Omaha. But I think some of that was expected. So that's about what I know on the expectations of casualties.
Thank you, Mark. This is, I remember this. I was there, gosh, I was 15, I think, so quite some time ago. I remember how impressive and the scenery and the cemetery made a bit lasting impression on me as well. So if we fast forward through 1944, what other mistakes was the German Army making? You already addressed the different strategies of Rommel and von Rundstedt. Is there anything else you see that happened in that year that's helped lead to an Allied victory sooner than later?
Yes. Everyone looks at the mistakes that Hitler made and Germany made. Obviously, one of the biggest ones was attacking Russia. But the other mistakes that he made was, he placed so much confidence in the West Wall, but he also required his troops to defend the entire perimeter, which was somewhat impossible. How can the German army defend all the way from the Norway coast down to the French-Spanish border? I don't know what that constitutes in miles, but it's significant. The other mistakes were that many times during the war, he would not allow German troops to retreat. So as we moved forward into the breakout of the Normandy campaign, and the U.S. troops got into Brittany, the Atlantic ports on the coast of Brittany, Hitler would not allow those troops to withdraw or surrender. So he just wasted troops that he could have used in other areas just by maintaining that no surrender, no retreat policy. We talked about the poor command structure, which was a mistake. We talked about the different strategies that you mentioned between Rommel and von Rundstedt. There was also the anti-Hitler conspiracy, because this is June of '44. Within a month, or maybe a little bit more than a month, is the attempted assassination of Hitler by the von Clausewitz and the Valkyrie conspiracy. And then we have Hitler himself, who considered himself a military strategist, and he really should have left military decisions up to the German general staff, and he did not. He just thought he was a military genius. And then probably the last mistake is the Germans, for as much as their intelligence efforts were vaunted, they totally disregarded all the signs of the Allied invasion in Normandy. But that's not to say that the Allies didn't make mistakes. We totally failed and missed to capitalize potentially on the anti-Hitler conspiracy. We didn't pick up the last-minute troop movements into Omaha. And Montgomery had pledged to be in Caen, which is about 20 miles from the coast in the center of the Normandy invasion area, by June 6th. But he never made it. He never made it until the end of July. There were many lessons learned from amphibious landings in the Pacific that were shared with the Allied command in Europe, but they were ignored. And then one of the bigger failures was the air bombardment and the naval bombardment, which was not able to eliminate the west wall or provide cover for the landing troops.
Thank you.
And I think that's about it. Do we have any questions?
So Mark, I'll ask one here at the very end, because that's a lot that we went through, and I for one am glad we have it now on video. We can replay and we can take a look at some of those maps, because I think that that's such an important thing to our understanding. But in looking at the overview and all of the things that you've studied, you know, I think it's World War II occupies so much of American history, you know, from middle school to high school to, you know, college classes or post-secondary ed classes. For you, what are the one or two biggest takeaways from all of this? For somebody who is steeped in this, studies this, often digs into it, what are the biggest takeaways that you have?
From D-Day or?
From D-Day. What lessons,
okay.
if we're to distill it down to one slide of the takeaways that history teaches us from this, for you, from your perspective as the historian here, what are those?
I think one of the biggest ones, shortly after June 6th, towards the end of June, I'm not sure the exact date, but across the globe in the Pacific, the U.S. military invaded the Mariana Islands. And for a country to be able to, even though it was for military use, which is probably not a good thing, industrial capacity, but to be able to produce weapons of war like we did, to support two fronts and to support our allies, to me, Rosie the Riveter and the Arsenal of Democracy, you know, as much as our troops gave their lives, the industrial capacity and what this country could do totally won the war, or definitely contributed to winning the war. That takeaway totally, I mean, as I did the research, I couldn't believe. In fact, I ended up doing a lecture on the Arsenal of Democracy, because I had to figure out, how did this country come out of the Depression and turn around its economy and be able to turn its industry basically on its head to be able to support the entire globe. We outproduced all of our allies put together, and Germany, Japan, and Italy. So, I mean, it's phenomenal. And we're only talking a period of years. We're talking, you know, from 41 to 44 for all intents and purposes. That was, I think, a big takeaway for me. The other takeaway, especially when I visited Normandy, is the sacrifice that those guys made. And, you know, you just can't forget that.
Well, and Mark, we have time for one audience question we're going to sneak in here. A person is actually curious about that, and that's, I appreciate, thank you for sharing that photo of that cemetery, and the person in the audience is asking how many people are buried there, just to revisit that, even if you just have a rough number, because I know when we look at that, I see a lot of crosses there.
Yeah, I do not know. I'm sure that's definitely information that can be found online. Again, it's you know, it's a U.S. battlefield memorial cemetery. It's U.S. soil, so that's run by the U.S. Battlefield Services, or whatever that organization is called. You know, and there's cemeteries all through Europe, but that is definitely one of them.
And we'll take a look, try to find that answer, track it down, put it in the comments section. We do appreciate that, appreciate all of the photos that you showed us from your journey, Mark. We asked you to do a lot in an hour. I think one of the things people are probably thinking about now is how do we bring about the Arsenal of Democracy lecture and maybe some of your other ones here to this digital space. So hopefully we can see you again here as we continue this kind of programming. But Mr. Mark Squeglia, a sharp historian, thank you for taking the time to join us for this Jefferson program here today.
Thank you.
Angela, you're on mute.
And a big thanks to the Corey Higher Ed Council for their continued support in the Jefferson Satellite Program Initiative.
Yeah, a big thanks to them. We're so glad for all of their help and support. And actually, that Arsenal of Democracy Talk was at one of our other satellite locations. We are looking forward to keeping that work going here at the Jefferson. And especially thanks to all of you for watching along at home. Thank you so much for tuning in to our digital programming here.
And please head over to our website at www.jesear.org if you want to find out more about upcoming programming and past Jefferson programs, as well as publications.
And be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and do subscribe to our YouTube channel for the Jefferson Educational Society. I'm Ben Spagan.
And I'm Angela Beaumont.
Be safe, be sound, and thanks for learning with us today.